In 1916, the richest woman in America lay dying in a black dress so old it had turned green, $100 million in her name, and a wooden stick pressed to a rupture she had refused for 20 years to let a surgeon close. Her name was Hetty Green. The papers called her a witch. She was not the only widow they named that way. One left a Richmond boarding house with no birthday anyone could prove, married a railroad king, then married his nephew, and bought 10 Rembrandts to bury a past she let no one read. Another took her dead husband's name-in-law, saved his bankrupt empire, then willed nearly $2 million to the women fighting for the vote. 3 widows, one narrow door in the law, and a country with a cruel word for any woman who walked through it. Before you go on, if these buried lives grip you the way they grip me, subscribe and stay close. I bring back the women the Gilded Age flattened into caricatures, the witches and the mystery women and the schemers, and I promise the stories only get stranger from here. Chapter 1. The one door the law left open. A married woman in 1870 owned almost nothing, not her wages if she earned any, not the furniture in her own parlor, not the house she lived in if the deed to it bore his name. Under the old doctrine the lawyers called coverture, a wife's legal self was folded into her husband's the moment she married, the way a smaller stream is swallowed by a larger river and loses its name. He spoke for her in court. He held what she brought to the marriage. Her signature, on most documents that mattered, meant nothing without his. She could be the daughter of the richest family in New England and still, on her wedding day, hand her whole fortune across the aisle to a man she had known for a season. This is the wall that stands behind all 3 of the women in this story, and the wall comes first, before the women who climbed it. The Married Women's Property Act spread across the states through the middle decades of the century, slowly, unevenly, one legislature at a time, and even where the law changed, the custom lagged behind it by a generation. A wife might, on paper, be allowed to hold something of her own, and still find every bank, every broker, every male relative treating her money as her husband's by right. The house of the law had many rooms, and one locked front door, and the key to the door hung, almost always, on a man's belt. But there was a crack in the wall. There was one door the law left unbolted, and it opened onto the strangest freedom the age offered a woman. That door was widowhood. A widow could hold property in her own name. She could sign a contract and mean it. She could sue and be sued and manage a fortune and refuse a suitor and answer to no husband because the husband was in the ground. Death did for a woman what no legislature would. It gave her back herself. The cruel arithmetic of the Gilded Age was that the surest way for a woman to command a great fortune was first to bury the man who had commanded it. And the world these women moved through policed that arithmetic without mercy. This was the age of the 400, the guest list that Mrs. Astor was said to keep, of the only families in New York that mattered, the narrow summit of a society that worshipped pedigree and feared new money more than sin. It was the age of the marriage market, when American fortunes shipped their daughters across the Atlantic to be traded for European titles, a coronet in exchange for a dowry, a wife's whole inheritance handed over for the right to be called a duchess. A woman, in that world, was a vessel for a fortune. She was the way money traveled from one man's house to another's, and she was watched and ranked and judged by how gracefully she carried it. To hold a fortune in her own hands, to sign for it and grow it and answer to no husband, was to break the deepest rule the age had, the rule that money might flow through a woman but must never belong to her. There was something else in the air of those years too, a taste for the uncanny running just beneath the polished surface. These were the decades of the seance and the spirit rapping, when respectable people sat in darkened parlors to speak with the dead, when the same newspapers that printed the stock tables traded in curses and hauntings and mysterious deaths. It was a culture primed to see something unnatural in a woman who would not behave, and quick to reach for the language of witchery when one refused to keep her place. So when these 3 widows took hold of their money, the age already had its words waiting for them. Witch, adventuress, schemer. The names were loaded long before the women ever earned them. 3 women walked through that door, and this is what binds them, though they never met and would have had little to say to one another if they had. One was a Quaker heiress from the whaling coast, who trusted no one and hoarded like a woman expecting winter. One was a girl from a Richmond boarding house who buried her own past so deep that historians still cannot find the bottom of it. One was a beauty who married 4 times, took a dead man's name for her own, and ended by handing a fortune to the very cause she had spent her life mocking. 3 keys, cut to fit 1 lock. And here is the color that runs through all 3 lives, the thread to hold on to: black. The black of widow's weeds, the mourning dress a woman was expected to wear as a flag of her grief and her availability, the uniform of the bereaved. Each of these 3 wore that black, and each of them turned it into something the mourning code never intended. On one, it became the rusted armor of a miser. On another, it became a veil, a wall of dark lace pulled down over a face no one was allowed to read. In the end, the black stopped meaning grief at all. It began to mean something the age had no word for and no comfort with. It began to mean a woman who owned. They were called witches for it. They were called adventuresses, and mystery women, and schemers, and worse. The society that had built its entire moral order on the belief that a woman should decorate a fortune and never command one kept its ugliest names in reserve for the women who commanded one anyway, and commanded it better than the men. Start with the most famous of them, the one the newspapers turned into a monster, the woman worth $100 million who would not buy herself a hot lunch. Chapter 2. She made her husband sign it away. Before Hetty Robinson would marry the man she loved, she made him put his renunciation of her fortune in writing. It was, by the standard of 1867, an almost unnatural act. A bride was supposed to bring her money to a marriage the way she brought her linens, as a gift that became her husband's on the day she took his name. Hetty brought a lawyer's understanding instead. She loved Edward Henry Green well enough to marry him. She did not love him or trust the world enough to let him near her money. So, the wealthy Vermont trader signed away his claim, and Hetty kept in her own hands the fortune that would make her, in time, the richest woman on earth. The iron in her was forged early, on the whaling coast of Massachusetts in New Bedford, where she was born in November of 1834, into a Quaker dynasty grown fat on whale oil. The Howlands and the Robinsons were among the great whaling families of New England, and the whaling merchant's creed ran in the household like a second religion: thrift, patience, the slow miracle of money left alone to grow. Hetty's father was Edward Mott Robinson, a hard and able man, and her mother was Abby Howland, and by the family's own telling, the little girl learned her catechism at the account books. She read the financial pages aloud to her grandfather and her father when she was small. She kept ledgers when other girls kept dolls. She was raised from the first to see a dollar not as a thing to spend, but as a living creature to be fed and never killed. That upbringing gave her a conviction she carried to her grave, one she would put into plain words late in life, and it belongs here at the start because the whole story bends back to it. She would say in later years that a girl raised on the principles of business would grow into a far happier woman than one raised only to marry well. She meant it as prophecy and as reproach. She had learned those principles in girlhood, and they had made her the equal of any man on Wall Street, and they had also, as this story will show, cost her things that money could not buy back. The fortune came to her in a single terrible year. In 1865, her father died, and left her something on the order of $5 million, a sum that included a great trust fund and would be worth, in the money of a later century, tens of millions more. In the very same year, her aunt Sylvia Ann Howland died as well. Between the 2 deaths, Hetty came into a fortune of roughly $10 million in bequests and trusts, an inheritance large enough to make a young woman one of the wealthiest people in the country before she had done a thing to earn it. But an inheritance is only a seed, and most heirs eat the seed. Hetty Green did the rare thing next, and did it with a ferocity that unsettled the men around her. She did not marry her money into a man's keeping and settle into a Fifth Avenue drawing room. She took the $10 million and went to work, and she treated the work as war. She bought government bonds when the country was bleeding and everyone else was selling. She bought railroad bonds and held them through panics that ruined bolder men. She bought mortgages on real estate across a growing nation and waited, with the patience of a woman who had all the time in the world, for the value to come to her. She kept vast reserves of cash for no reason her rivals could understand, until the day the reserves made her the most powerful lender in New York. And through all of it, she kept her marriage at arm's length from her ledgers. When Edward Green's own speculations later soured and his creditors came looking, they found nothing of hers to take, because she had walled her fortune off from his at the altar. There was one moment that tested the wall and proved it. Her husband kept his accounts and some of hers at a banking house called John J. Cisco and Son. And when Edward's speculations went bad, the firm itself began to fail, with Hetty's deposits tangled up in the wreck. The bankers tried to hold her money against her husband's debts. Hetty refused them, coldly and completely. She descended on the firm, demanded her securities, and when they hesitated, she made it plain that she would pull the whole house down before she let a single dollar of hers pay for Edward's losses. She got her securities out. The marriage did not survive the fight whole, and the couple drifted into long years of living apart. But the fortune came through it untouched. It was the lesson of her whole life proven in one hard week. Love a man if you must, but never, under any circumstances, let his bank or his creditors get their hands on what is yours. The scale of what she had built by then is worth setting down in plain figures, because the numbers are the truest portrait of her. She had come into something near $10 million from her father and her aunt in a single year, as she poured it into government bonds bought cheap in the nation's worst hours, into railroad bonds held through panics that ruined bolder men, into mortgages on land across a growing country, and into hard cash kept in reserve when reserves looked to everyone else like weakness. She spent almost nothing on herself, holding to the price of a bowl of oatmeal while she moved sums that would have staggered most of the banks in the city. She did it with no partner, no firm that bore her name, no seat that any exchange in the country would have granted to a woman. She did it from a borrowed desk, with a ledger and a will of iron, and year upon year the fortune only grew. She was, in every sense that counted, a woman running a fortune alone, long before the death of her husband in 1902 made her a widow in the eyes of the law. She had simply arranged her life so that no man, not even the one she married, ever held the key to her door. She had cut her own key, and she guarded it like a woman who knew exactly what it was worth. Wallich Chapter 3. The Will That Hid a Forgery. When her Aunt Sylvia died, Hetty produced a second will that left her everything and a clause that killed every will after it. It was the boldest move of her young life, and it very nearly branded her a forger before the whole nation. The facts are these, and the historians still argue over the shadows between them. Sylvia Ann Howland died in 1865, leaving an estate of around $2 million. Her will, the one the executors meant to honor, gave roughly half of it to charities and other heirs, and held the rest in a trust for her niece Hetty. Trusts were the age's polite cage for a woman's money. The income was hers, but the principal was locked away, managed by trustees, kept forever out of her direct control. To a woman like Hetty, who trusted no hand but her own, a trust was an insult dressed as a kindness. The income handed over with one palm, while the other palm locked the fortune itself in a stranger's keeping. So, Hetty contested the will, and she did more than contest it. She produced an earlier will, one that left her the entire estate outright, and attached to it a separate page bearing a clause that declared any later will invalid. If that page was genuine, it swept away the trust and the charities alike and made Hetty the sole and absolute heir to everything her aunt had owned. If that page was not genuine, then Hetty Robinson had tried to steal a fortune with a forged signature and had done it in open court. The case became famous, and it became famous for a reason that had nothing to do with the money. The defense brought in mathematics. A mathematician named Benjamin Pierce, one of the finest minds in the country, studied the disputed signature alongside genuine ones, together with his son, and testified to something the court had never heard before. The signatures matched too well. Two genuine signatures by the same hand always differ in 100 small ways, because no human being can write a name twice exactly alike. But the disputed signature lay over a genuine one, with a closeness that could only be produced by tracing. The Pierces put a number to the odds against such a match arising by nature, a number so vast it amounted to impossibility, and they laid that reasoning before the court. It was one of the first times anyone had used the mathematics of probability as evidence in an American courtroom, and it is remembered in the history of forensic science to this day. The ruling went against Hetty on the forged clause. The court would not accept the page that would have given her everything. Whether Hetty herself traced the signature or believed in good faith that the document was real, the record does not finally prove, and an honest telling has to leave that shadow where it lies. She was never convicted of a crime, but the accusation clung to her, the first of many. The opening line in the long public legend of a woman who would do anything, anything at all, where money was concerned. The fight itself dragged on for the better part of 5 years, a war of depositions and appeals between a young heiress and the trustees of her aunt's estate, and it hardened something in her that was already hard. By the end, by many accounts, she came away with a settlement in the neighborhood of $600,000, a fraction of what the disputed page would have handed her outright, and a distrust of lawyers and trustees and the whole machinery of other people managing her money that never once left her. It taught her the creed she built the rest of her life around. Trust no hand but your own. Sign nothing you have not read twice. Assume that everyone, the banker, the trustee, the lawyer, the husband, is reaching quietly for your purse. It was a poisonous way to move through the world, and it made her very nearly unbeatable at the one thing she cared about. She walked away with her trust intact and her reputation stained, and she did the only thing she ever did with a setback. She went back to work. Over the decades that followed, she built the 10 million into a force that the men of Wall Street could not ignore and could not quite believe. She did it from the least likely throne room in the history of American finance. She refused to pay for an office of her own. Instead, she set herself up at the Chemical National Bank on Broadway, where she kept her accounts. And there she worked, often seated among her papers on the floor, a plain woman in a plain black dress surrounded by the deeds and bonds and mortgages that made her one of the richest people alive. Clerks stepped around her, millionaires came to her, and the woman on the floor, counting, always counting, held more ready cash than most of the banks that towered over her. Her method never changed, and its plainness was the whole secret of it. She waited. Where other investors chased the boom and borrowed to chase it faster, Hetty sat on her cash through the fat years and swallowed the mockery of men who thought her timid. Then, when a panic came and the reckless were ruined and good property could be had for pennies on the dollar, she struck, buying bonds and mortgages and whole railroads from desperate sellers at the bottom and holding them until the fear passed and the value climbed back to meet her. She lent money to men who had sneered at her, and she charged them a fair rate and collected it without pity. She read every contract with her own eyes. She trusted no partner living, and slowly, without a single showy stroke, the plain woman on the bank floor became the most powerful private lender in the city of New York. The image would have been comic if it had not been, before long, the thing that saved a city. Chapter 4. The richest woman ate cold oatmeal. The wealthiest woman in the world warmed her lunch of oatmeal on a radiator, so she would not have to pay for a hot meal. This is the detail everyone remembers about Hetty Green, and it stands for 100 others like it, and it is the door to the sadder truth underneath. The legend is thick, and some of it is true, and some of it is the cruelty of a press that had found a woman it could safely mock. She wore, by many accounts, a single black dress until it faded toward green, and she instructed a laundress to wash only the hem of it, only the part that dragged in the street, to save on soap. She bought broken cookies in bulk because the broken ones came cheaper than the whole. She was said to have spent hours hunting for a lost 2-cent stamp, hours that would have earned a fortune had she spent them at her ledgers, because to Hetty, the principle mattered more than the arithmetic. A thing lost was a thing owed to her, and she would have it back. She moved between cheap rented flats in Hoboken and in Brooklyn, partly out of thrift and partly out of strategy, because a woman with no fixed grand residence was a woman harder for the tax collector to pin down. While her peers built marble palaces along Fifth Avenue, the richest of them all lived like a widow, counting pennies in a boarding house. The newspapers feasted on all of it. For decades, she was the reliable grotesque of the American press, the miser queen, the woman worth more than the banks who dressed like a scrub woman and haggled over a nickel. They wrote that she carried her lunch in her pocket. They wrote that she argued with tradesmen over scraps. They wrote that she wore the same black bonnet until it fell to pieces on her head. Some of it was true, and much of it was the ordinary cruelty of a country that had found a woman it could safely laugh at, because she was rich enough that the laughter could not wound her, and strange enough that it felt deserved. And the cruelty did a job beyond the joke. It made her small enough to hold in the mind. A woman that rich and that powerful was a frightening thing, an offense against the natural order, and a witch in a rusted dress was so much easier to picture than a female financier who had simply beaten the men at their trade. The costume kept her at arm's length. The joke kept the fear at bay. For years, she endured a rupture, a hernia, rather than pay a surgeon to repair it. Her solution was a wooden stick pressed against the swelling and held in place by her clothing and the pressure of her own leg. A homemade brace worn by a woman who could have bought the hospital. When at last she let a doctor examine her near the end of her life, and he told her the surgery would cost $150. She scowled and bent down and picked her fallen stick up off the floor and put it back where it had been. She would treat her own body the way she treated a bad bond. She would not overpay to fix it. There is a whole philosophy hidden in that refusal, and it is the key to the woman. To Hetty Green, spending was loss always, in every form. A dollar laid out on a hot meal, on a decent flat, on a surgeon, on a clean new dress, was a dollar cut out of the living body of her fortune and killed. She could not bring herself to do it. The same instinct that made her a genius at the ledger made her a prisoner of it, unable to enjoy a penny of the mountain she had raised, unable to buy herself comfort even as her own body began to fail. She had more money than almost anyone alive, and she lived like a pauper, not out of need, but out of a compulsion. She could no more switch off than she could stop her own heart. The fortune was not her servant. It was her keeper, and she guarded it the way the truly haunted guard the thing that owns them. It is easy to laugh at this. The papers laughed at it for decades. But turn the same trait a few degrees, and it stops being funny, because the same refusal to overpay, the same terror of being cheated because she was rich, reached one day past her ledgers and into the body of her son. This is the single wound at the heart of the Hetty Green story, and it deserves to be told honestly, with both its versions standing side by side, because the truth of it was fought over even within her own family. The boy was Edward, called Ned, and as a child, he hurt his leg. In the version the world has repeated for a century, Hetty, frightened that a doctor would charge her a fortune the moment he recognized the famous heiress, took her injured son to free clinics meant for the poor, was recognized anyway, was turned away, and delayed proper treatment until the leg had rotted past saving and had to be cut off. It is a monstrous story, and it became the keystone of her legend, the proof that she loved money more than her own child. But her daughter told it differently, and a fair account has to let the daughter speak. Hetty went from doctor to doctor, Sylvia said, for 3 days, searching for one who believed the leg could be saved rather than amputated. In that telling, the delay was the opposite of greed. It was a mother going door to door, refusing to accept the verdict that the leg could not be saved. Either way, the leg was lost. The boy grew into a man with one leg, and, in a final grim footnote the family never lived down, the amputated limb itself would surface as a macabre curiosity long after. And here's the thing the legend cannot decide, and neither, honestly, can anyone. Whether it was cruelty or love that cost Ned his leg, it came from the very same root. The refusal to be overcharged, the conviction that the world was always trying to cheat her, the trait that built the fortune, reaching out to maim the one thing the fortune was supposed to protect. She had spent her life guarding her door. She had not thought that the guarding itself could be the danger inside the house. Chapter 5. The Only Woman at Morgan's Table. When the panic of 1907 broke the banks, the men who had mocked her for decades came to Hetty Green for cash. It is the great reversal of her life, and it happened in a single autumn, and it is the moment the caricature cracks open and reveals the financier underneath. For years she had watched the market climb on borrowed confidence, and she had said, to anyone who would listen, that it could not last. The rich, she warned, were approaching the brink. A panic was inevitable, and while the bolder men chased the last of the boom, Hetty did the unglamorous thing she always did. She sat on cash. She called in loans. She kept her powder dry through the good years, absorbing the mockery, the woman too frightened of loss to enjoy her own wealth, until the autumn, the sky fell in, and every laugh turned to a plea. As the crash came, the banks began to fail across New York. Depositors lined the streets. Great houses of finance that had seemed eternal discovered they could not lay their hands on ready money because ready money had vanished into fear. And in the middle of it stood a plain woman in a black dress with more cash on hand than institutions 10 times her size. She lent to failing banks. And when the city of New York itself, the government of the largest city in the country, found that it could not borrow to meet its own obligations, it came to Hetty Green, and she lent the city over $1 million, $1,100,000, and she took the city's short-term notes in return. And she did it at 6% when she could have named almost any figure she liked. She said as much afterward with the flat pride of a woman who kept her word and her rates. Those to whom she lent money, she said, got it at 6%. She might just as easily have secured 40. She had the city over a barrel, and she charged it a fair price. And that restraint, from the woman the papers called a witch, tells you more about her than any story about a stamp. She was not cruel with a debtor at her mercy. She was only, always correct. There is a scene from that crisis that the histories return to again and again, and it deserves to be told with the caution it has earned, because it has hardened from fact into legend at the edges. When the greatest financier of the age, the man whose name was a synonym for money, gathered the titans of Wall Street to stop the panic from swallowing the country, and the most powerful men in America filed into his library to decide the fate of the economy, one figure at that table, by the accounts that survive, was a woman, Hetty Green, the only woman in the room where the men decided whether the nation would stand or fall. Picture her there, in the dress washed only at the hem, among the starched titans who had spent years turning her into a joke, holding in her plain hands a share of the cash that would decide the outcome. The woman on the floor of the bank had become the woman at the center of the storm, and this is the collapse of the whole legend into a single image. Not the stamp, not the oatmeal. $100 million woman in a rusted black dress, squatting among her deeds on the floor of the Chemical National Bank, who, when the towers of finance trembled, turned out to be the steadiest pillar of them all. The black dress that the age read as madness was, all along, the uniform of the one investor with the discipline to be ready. They called her a witch because they had no honest word for a woman who beat them at their own game and dressed like a pauper while she did it. She lived out her last years, much as she had lived all the others, in rented rooms, in the same black, guarding the same fortune. There was one softening near the close. The husband she had held at arm's length for so long, Edward Green, came back into her care at the end of his life, and Hetty, the woman the papers called heartless, nursed him through his final illness until he died in 1902. She was a widow now in law as well as in fact, and she carried on alone for another 14 years. In the summer of 1916, past her 80th year, worn down by a series of strokes, she died in a house on a New York street, the richest woman in America to the very last. Her fortunate death was reckoned at something like $100 million, and by some counts, the whole of her estate ran closer to $200 million, a sum that in the money of a later century would climb into the billions. She divided it between her two children, and there the last irony of her life played out. The fortune she had starved herself to build did not harden into a dynasty. Her son Ned inherited and spent with the abandon of a man set free at last from his mother's discipline, a lavish and eccentric collector, the mirror image of everything she had been. Her daughter Sylvia, raised in the same cold thrift, lived quietly, and when she in turn died, the bulk of the Green fortune passed on to charities and institutions and scattered to the winds. Within a single generation, the mountain Hetty had guarded so ferociously was gone, given away, handed to the very world she had trusted so little. And the woman herself, laughed at for decades as a witch, would wait the better part of a century to be seen plainly at last, as the thing she had been all along, the first great female financier America ever produced. She had guarded, and only ever guarded. She never turned that fortune outward, never built with it, never spent it into something that outlived her. She kept it. That was her genius and her prison both. And the next widow in this story would do the opposite. She would take a dead man's empire and pour it out into marble and canvas and pearls, and spend a second fortune not to guard a past, but to bury one. Chapter 6. A boarding house girl with no birthday. Arabella Huntington would end her life the richest woman in America, and no one, then or now, can prove the year she was born. This is the first fact about her, and in a way the only one, because everything else she built was built to keep it that way. She came into the world as Arabella Duval Yarrington, in or around Richmond, Virginia, at the start of the 1850s. The year is a guess. No birth certificate has ever been found. Her father was a machinist named Richard Milton Yarrington, and when he died, at the end of the 1850s, her mother was left to keep the family by keeping a boarding house in Richmond, taking in strangers for their rent. This was the world Arabella was born to, not the drawing room, the back stairs of it. A house where a girl learned early that respectability was a performance other people paid for by the week, and that the line between a lady and a landlady's daughter was thinner than anyone liked to admit. For a girl with beauty and ambition and nothing else, the arithmetic was brutal, and she seems to have understood it very young. A daughter of a machinist, raised in a rented house full of paying strangers, had exactly one asset the world would value, and it was herself. She had no dowry to carry into a good marriage, no family name to open a good door, no fortune to make her mistakes forgivable. What she had was her face, her wit, and a will as hard in its own way as Hetty Green's, though it would never show itself in a ledger, and she grasped, it seems, the single unforgiving truth of her position. In a world that let a woman own nothing, a woman without money had only one currency to spend, and she would have to spend it carefully, and once, and for the highest price the market would bear. Everything Arabella later became, the wife, the widow, the collector, the mystery, grew out of that early and merciless sum. From that boarding house she rose to a height almost no American woman of her century reached, and the climb is wrapped in a fog she spent her life maintaining. In her teens she went to New York in the company of a man named John Archer Worsham, and there, by the middle of the 1860s, she came into the orbit of one of the richest men in the country, Collis Huntington, one of the four titans behind the great railroads of the West. The surviving letters suggest that Arabella and Collis knew each other as early as 1867. Collis was married, his wife was living, and into this arrangement, in March of 1870, a son was born to Arabella, a boy named Archer. Who fathered that child is the mystery that sits at the center of her life, and honesty requires holding it open rather than closing it. She claimed a marriage to Worsham, though the evidence that such a marriage ever existed is thin. Collis Huntington and the boy Archer would, in later years, call each other father and son, and those who saw them together remarked on a strong physical resemblance. One account, traced to Archer himself, held that Collis met Arabella when he lodged at her mother's boarding house, took her to New York, fell in love, and arranged a marriage to Worsham only to give the coming child a name. It is a tidy story. There is no document that proves it. What the record leaves behind is a pattern rather than a fact. A young woman of no fortune, a married railroad king, a child of uncertain paternity, and a silence, carefully kept, over all of it for the rest of her life. The kindest reading of Arabella's youth and the cruelest reading arrive at the very same facts and only judge them differently. In the cruelest telling, she was a kept woman, a mistress installed and provided for by a married railroad king, a girl who traded her body for a fortune and then spent the rest of her days scrubbing the bargain out of the record. In the kindest telling, she was a young woman with no protection in a world that offered women none, who fell in love with a powerful man, bore his child, and waited with remarkable patience for the first wife to die and the marriage to become possible. The documents do not settle which it was. What the documents show is the concealment itself, the vagueness about her age, the uncertain marriage to Worsham, the silence maintained for decades over everything that came before Collis. Whatever the truth of her origins, Arabella treated it as a wound to be dressed and hidden, and in time she would dress it in the richest bandages money could buy. What is beyond dispute is that Collis Huntington raised the boy as his own, and that Arabella became, by whatever road, the most important person in that Titan's private world. In 1883, Collis Huntington's first wife, Elizabeth, died of cancer, and within a year, in July of 1884, Collis married Arabella. The ceremony was performed by the most celebrated preacher in America, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, in the parlor of Arabella's own house on West 54th Street in New York. Collis adopted her son. The boarding house girl with no provable birthday was now the wife of a railroad emperor, and the whispers that would follow her forever, that she had been his mistress before she was his wife, that she had risen on exactly the currency a lady was never supposed to spend, followed her into the marriage and never left. She would spend the next 40 years and a great share of one of America's largest fortunes, trying to bury a past that no amount of money could quite cover over. Chapter 7. She married the uncle, then the nephew. In 1884, she married one of the richest men in America, and when he died, she married his nephew and doubled the fortune. Set the two weddings side by side, and the strategy in them is breathtaking, whether you read it as love or as the coldest calculation of the age. The first marriage lasted 16 years, and they were, by the accounts that survive, contented ones. Collis Huntington was one of the four men, with Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, and Leland Stanford, who had built the Central Pacific and the Southern Pacific Railroads and stitched the Far West to the rest of the nation with iron. His fortune was of the largest kind the century produced, a fortune measured not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the tens of millions, drawn from the freight of a continent. Arabella lived inside that fortune as its mistress, learning its scale, developing the eye and the appetite that would define her later life. Those 16 years remade her. The girl from the Richmond boarding house became, as the wife of Collis Huntington, one of the grand hostesses of American wealth, mistress of great houses, a figure at the highest tables, her every want met by one of the largest incomes in the land. She learned in those years how the very rich lived, what they bought, how they judged one another, and she learned it with the fierce attention of a woman who had once stood on the cold side of that glass. Collis, for his part, seems to have adored her, and to have shielded her, adopting her son, giving her his name, raising around her the wall of respectability she would spend the rest of her life reinforcing. When he died, she was no longer the obscure young woman who had come to New York on the arm of John Archer Worsham. She was a Huntington, and she meant to remain one. And when Collis died, in 1900, that fortune split. A great share came to Arabella. Another great share came to Collis's nephew, a railroad man in his own right named Henry Huntington. Look at what that split created. One of the greatest fortunes in America, built by a single man, was suddenly divided between two heirs who happened to be free to marry each other. Henry was the nephew, tied by blood to the dead husband, but not to the widow, so the law raised no bar between them, and whoever married the other would reunite the halves. It is possible to read the years that followed as a slow and patient courtship, and it is possible to read them as a slow and patient calculation, and the truth very likely holds a little of both. What is certain is the result. By marrying Henry, Arabella would gather back into a single pair of hands the fortune that Collis had spent a lifetime building, and that death had briefly broken apart. Few people in the whole history of American money have ever been placed to make one marriage worth so much, and fewer still have had the nerve to make it. Now, the widow held one of the largest fortunes in America in her own name. Through the one door the law left open to her. She could have stopped there. She was rich beyond any need, free beyond any expectation for a woman of her origins. Instead, she made the move that would scandalize two continents and consolidate a dynasty. For years, the possibility had been a joke among Henry Huntington's friends, a running tease that the widowed aunt and the railroad nephew might marry, a rumor Henry himself denied again and again. And then, in July of 1913, at the American church in Paris, far from the American society that would have gasped at it, Henry Huntington married Arabella Duval Huntington. The widow married her late husband's nephew, and the two shares of the Huntington fortune, split by one man's death, came back together in a single pair of hands, hers. There was no crime in it, and no blood tie between the bride and the groom, but society did not trouble itself with such distinctions. To the world it looked like something close to a family scandal, the widow of the great man taking the great man's nephew, keeping the fortune and the name sealed inside a closed circle, as though Huntington money could not bear to be parted from a Huntington bed. The couple seemed to have felt the weight of it, which is the likeliest reason they married abroad, in the hush of a Paris church, rather than beneath the chandeliers of New York. And still the whispers crossed the ocean faster than they did. The woman who had spent 30 years trying to outrun the word mistress had now, in the eyes of her enemies, gone and confirmed it, by marrying twice into the same fortune and letting not $1 of it slip away. The reaction was everything you would expect, and worse. Among the women of Henry's own family, a hard dislike of Arabella had been curdling for years, and the marriage confirmed every suspicion they held. Here was the woman of unknown origins, the suspected former mistress, who had married the uncle and now married the nephew, and in doing so had gathered a railroad empire's whole fortune to herself. To her enemies it looked like the final maneuver of a lifelong schemer, a woman who had used marriage the way a general uses terrain, and who had now taken the high ground for good. But there is another way to see it, and a full account owes her that too. Arabella and Henry shared something rarer in that world than money, which they both already had in abundance. They shared a passion. Both of them wanted more than almost anything to build a collection of beautiful things that would outlast them. And in each other, they found the one partner whose ambition matched their own. The marriage that scandalized society became the engine of one of the greatest art-buying campaigns in the history of the country. She had spent the first fortune learning what beauty was worth. Now, with the two fortunes joined, she would spend on a scale that even the Gilded Age had rarely seen, and she would spend it, in the end, on a single desperate purpose: to buy the one thing a boarding house in Richmond had never given her. Chapter 8. 10 Rembrandts to bury a past. With a fortune no one could question, Arabella bought the one thing her past could never give her: an unquestionable pedigree. She could not purchase a birthday, or a bloodline, or the silence of the whisperers. But she could purchase the things that pedigree collected, and surround herself so completely with the objects of old and unassailable respectability that no one would dare look past them to the boarding house behind. And so, she became, to the society that could never quite place her, a figure of pure mystery. She gave almost nothing away. She was evasive about her age to the point of legend, vague about her origins, guarded in her friendships, seen in public behind veils and dark glass. Where Hetty Green drew the scorn of the newspapers by living too plainly, Arabella starved them of the one thing they craved: a straight story about who she really was. The silence was itself a kind of wealth, a thing she could afford that poorer women could not. The sheer luxury of refusing to explain herself. It made her fascinating, and it made her suspect, and it kept the whisperers whispering, but it never once handed them a fact to hang the whisper on. She had learned, in the boarding house, the oldest lesson of the vulnerable: a story you never tell can never be used against you. Her guide into this world was the most famous and most persuasive art dealer of the age, a man named Joseph Duveen, who made his fortune selling European masterpieces to American millionaires with more money than certainty. Duveen understood, better than any man alive, the precise hunger Arabella carried, because he had built his whole fortune upon it. His genius was to see that the new American rich did not truly want paintings so much as they wanted what paintings conferred: the aura of old Europe, the feeling of having always belonged. He sold standing, dressed as art, and he sold it at prices that stopped the breath, and his clients paid gladly, because the thing they were buying could be got no other way. To Arabella, he was more than a dealer. He was the architect of the disguise she had spent her whole life assembling. Every canvas he sold her was another stone in the wall between the world and Richmond, and he knew it, and she knew it. And between them, they raised one of the most magnificent private collections the country had ever seen, out of a single unspoken understanding: that a great enough hoard of beauty can quiet almost any question about where its owner began. Under his hand, Arabella became one of the most important collectors of her generation. Through Duveen, she acquired, in a single stroke, some $2.5 million of paintings and objects from the celebrated Rodolphe Kahn collection, a trove that included works by Vermeer, by Van Dyck, by Frans Hals, and something on the order of 10 paintings by Rembrandt. Between 1908 and 1917, she and Henry spent around $21 million on fine art, a sum that in that era could have built a railroad of its own. Into their hands came a Rembrandt, a Velázquez, and the most famous of all, Gainsborough's Blue Boy, the shimmering portrait that would become the signature of the collection. Read that list again and see what she was doing. Old masters, devotional images, Madonnas and saints, the sacred art of medieval and Renaissance Europe, the furniture of French kings, the decorative arts of Louis XIV and Louis XV. She was assembling, canvas by canvas, the visible proof of a lineage she did not have. A woman rumored to have risen as a rich man's mistress filled her houses with images of saints. A woman with no provable pedigree covered her walls with the pedigree of Europe itself. Every purchase was a brick in a wall, and the wall was built to stand between the world and West 54th Street, between the world and Richmond, between the world and whatever the truth of her origins had been. And there is a detail from her later years that turns this whole effort into something close to tragedy. As she aged, Arabella's sight began to fail, until she was, by many accounts, nearly blind. She lived behind veils, dark lace, and dark glass, a reclusive and guarded figure who let almost no one close. Hold that image against the collection she had built. A half-blind woman standing in a room, hung with 10 Rembrandts and a Vermeer and the Blue Boy, surrounded by the most beautiful objects money could gather, and barely able to see them. She had bought a wall of masterpieces to prove she belonged among the highborn, and in the end, she could not even look at them. The past she had spent a fortune to bury was the one thing she could still see clearly in the dark behind her veils. Around her, always, was the son whose birth had begun it all. Archer, the boy of the uncertain paternity, had grown into a serious and scholarly man, a collector and a student in his own right, and he remained the fixed center of her private world to the end. When she died, everything, the fortune and the collection both, would pass to him. It is a strange and human thing that a life spent building walls against the world's questions should come to rest, at the last, on the one person who was those questions made flesh. Whatever the truth of who had fathered him, Archer was the single thread that ran through the whole of Arabella's life, from the boarding house to the gallery, and to him she left all of it. This is the mourning black again, worn a different way. On Hetty, it had been the miser's armor. On Arabella, it became the veil, the dark lace pulled down over a face no one was permitted to read, concealment worn as a second skin. She won every battle money could win. She got the name, the fortune, the collection, the marble monument. She never won the only thing she truly wanted, which was to be seen without suspicion, to be a lady whose past required no wall. She commanded one of the largest fortunes in America, and she could not command her own story, and the whispers outlived every million she spent to silence them. Arabella guarded a past. The next widow guarded nothing, hid nothing, and did the most audacious thing of the three. She did not marry into a fortune, or inherit one, or defend one. She took a dead man's name for her own, in law, on the masthead, and turned his empire and his identity into her instrument. And then, at the very end, she aimed the whole of it at the men who had made women like her climb through a bedroom to reach a boardroom. Chapter 9. The Beauty Who Climbed Over Men. The last of the three widows was the most dangerous, because she did not inherit a fortune so much as manufacture herself. Hetty was born to money and guarded it. Arabella married into money and hid behind it. Miriam Leslie was born to almost nothing, and she made her fortune the way she made everything else in her life, out of beauty, nerve, and an absolute refusal to stay the person the world had last filed her under. She came into the world as Miriam Florence Fallen in the summer of 1836, and by the end, she had worn more names than most people meet in a lifetime: Peacock, Squire, Leslie, Wild, and, when the mood took her, a title she awarded to herself out of thin air, the Baroness de Bazus, complete with an invented descent from French nobility. Each name was a costume, and each costume was a climb, and she wore every one of them as though she had been born to it, which was the whole trick of her. The beauty came first, because in the world she was born into, it was the only capital a girl like her could raise. Her first marriage, at 18, to a jeweler's assistant named David Charles Peacock, was a hasty affair, annulled after about 2 years, the kind of early stumble a careful woman would spend a lifetime hiding. Miriam did not hide it. She turned to the stage and toured for a time in the company of the most notorious performer of the age, the dancer and adventuress Lola Montez, billed as Montez's sister under the name Minnie. To travel with Lola Montez was to apprentice yourself to the art of the self-invented woman, the woman who lived by her looks and her wits and her sheer front, who treated respectability as a wardrobe to be put on and taken off as the situation required. Miriam learned the lesson to the bone. Between the annulled marriage and the respectable one, there were years the biographies handle carefully, years in which a beautiful young woman with no money and no protector survived the only way such a woman could. By the spring of 1857, she had become the mistress of a married banker who sat in Congress, kept by a powerful man, because keeping was the arrangement on offer. It did not last the year. By the autumn, she had turned from the banker to a new man, and this one she would marry. There is little point in prettying it up. Miriam Follin spent her youth trading the one thing the world would pay her for, and she traded it shrewdly, always moving upward, always toward the man with more, and she felt By every sign that survives, not a flicker of shame about it. Shame was a luxury for women with other choices. She had none, and she knew it, and she played the only hand she held. Then came the marriage that made her name in scandal before it made her name in print. In 1857, she married Ephraim George Squire, a distinguished archaeologist and a man of real standing, an agent of the railway interests then carving up Central America. For a time, she was the respectable Mrs. Squire. But respectability was never the destination for Miriam, only a stop along the way. Squire worked in the orbit of the reigning king of illustrated journalism, a publisher named Frank Leslie, whose papers filled American parlors with engravings of every sensation of the day. Leslie became the couple's employer, and in time, their tenant and their intimate. Anne Miriam, editor now of one of Leslie's own magazines, left her husband for the more powerful man. The arrangement had a particular cruelty built into it, because the three of them lived tangled together. Frank Leslie was no stranger who swept Miriam away from afar. He was her husband's employer, the man whose magazines paid the Squire's bills, and for a time, he was their tenant and their intimate too, sharing the household, dining at their table, a constant presence in the very marriage he was quietly dissolving. Miriam, sharp and ambitious and stifled as the wife of a scholar, looked across her own parlor at the reigning king of illustrated journalism, a man of real power and real money, and she made her choice. She would not stay the wife of the archaeologist while the publisher sat there for the taking. The betrayal unfolded not at a distance but at close quarters, night after night, under one roof, and that is what made it a scandal the whole trade remembered for a generation. The wreckage of that choice is part of the record, and it is the darkest thing in her story. Ephraim Squire, the abandoned husband, did not recover. By the accounts that survive, he was left heartbroken and, in the harsh word of the sources, insane, his mind giving way under the collapse of his marriage and his standing. Miriam divorced him in the spring of 1873 and married Frank Leslie. She had climbed again, over the body of the man who had lifted her out of the boarding stage and into the world of print, and she did not look back down. It is not a comfortable story, and it should not be told as though it were. She used the men in her life as rungs, and one of those men broke under the weight of being used. But the age had given her a brutal choice, beauty or nothing, marriage or destitution, and she had simply played the only hand a woman was dealt, and played it without mercy and without apology, all the way to the top of the illustrated press. But it would be a mistake to see only the climber, because the woman who reached the summit of the illustrated press was no mere ornament passed from man to man. She was quick, well-read, fluent in more than one language, a real editor with a real sense of what the public would buy, and the men she climbed over had all, at first, missed exactly that. Squire had married a beauty and found himself living with a rival. Leslie married a decoration and would leave behind, when he died, the one person on earth capable of saving what he had built. The men in Miriam's life kept making the same error, over and over. They saw the face and overlooked the mind behind it. It was a mistake the whole world would go on making, until the day she took a dead man's name and proved, in the hardest currency there is, exactly what she had always been. Fiesta Chapter 10. She took the dead man's name. When Frank Leslie died, he left a publishing empire $300,000 in debt and a widow who refused to let it fall. This is the hinge of her whole life. The moment the beauty and the scandal fall away, and something harder and more surprising stands up in their place. Frank Leslie died in 1880. His great illustrated papers, the engine that had made him famous, were drowning in liabilities. His will was contested. Any reasonable person, and certainly any reasonable widow of that era, would have sold the wreck for what it would fetch and walked away with whatever was left. The size of the wreck is the truest measure of the rescue. Frank Leslie had run his empire on borrowed money and spectacle, and when he died, the borrowing all came due at once. $300,000 of debt hung over the papers. Rival claimants dragged the will into court. Creditors circled the offices, and the person the whole ruin fell upon was a widow, in an age when a widow running any business at all was a curiosity, and a widow running a great and failing one was very nearly unheard of. The bankers who watched her take the reins had seen this moment 100 times, and it always ended the same way, with the widow selling out and retreating into her mourning. They did not yet grasp that this particular widow had spent her entire life refusing the script she was handed, and that she had no intention of obeying this one either. Miriam did the opposite, and the way she did it has no real precedent in the century. She took the failing business into her own two hands and set about saving it. She cut, she reorganized. She drove the papers back toward profit with a ruthlessness the trade had not expected from Frank Leslie's decorative widow. And then, in 1881, she made the move that turned a rescue into a legend. She went to law and changed her own name. Legally, formally on the record, Miriam Leslie became Frank Leslie. The dead man's name, the name on the masthead, the name that meant the whole enterprise in the mind of every reader and advertiser in America, became her name. She did not run the company as the widow of Frank Leslie. She ran it as Frank Leslie, the woman who had made herself into the man whose empire she had inherited. Sit for a moment with how strange that act was even now. A woman went before a court and asked to be granted a man's full name as her own legal identity, and the court agreed. And from that day the checks were signed, Frank Leslie in a woman's hand, the contract sealed with a dead man's name worn by a living woman, the masthead telling the truth and the lie in the very same 3 syllables. It was disguise and declaration at once. To the reader, it announced that nothing had changed, that the great house of Leslie went on as before. To Miriam, it meant that everything had changed, because the name that had belonged to the man now belonged to her, along with the power and the debt and the whole roaring machine. She had done more than inherit an empire. She had annexed an identity, and she wore it for the rest of her working life as easily as she wore her jewels. It worked. Under her hand, the circulation of the popular monthly, one of the crown jewels of the Leslie stable, rose by 200,000 in the space of 4 months. She styled herself the Empress of Journalism, and for once the title was earned rather than invented. She lived as flamboyantly as she worked, decked in jewels, holding court, spending the fortune she was rebuilding almost as fast as it came in, lying cheerfully about her age to any interviewer who asked. By the time she was 53, she was still telling the press she was in her 30s, and she said it with such conviction that some of them printed it. She invented the Baroness de Bazus in these years, tracing her family, she announced, to French nobility, awarding herself a title no government had ever granted. The boarding house girl who had toured as Lola Montez's sister now presided over an American publishing empire under a dead man's name and a made-up French barony, and she carried the whole improbable performance off by sheer force of will. Her wit was the mortar that held the performance together, and a little of it survives, enough to hear her still. When she boasted in her grand way of subscribers stretching from the Bowery to Budapest, from Harlem to Hong Kong, she caught herself in the exaggeration and answered it out loud, gleefully, in the same breath. "You circulation liar," she called herself, "and the joke tells you everything." Here was a woman entirely aware that her whole life was a magnificent bluff, and entirely unbothered by it because the bluff was working. She had taken a man's name and a man's ruined empire, and she had made both of them pay. And here is the irony that sets up everything to come. In the pages of her own magazines, this most independent woman in American publishing dispensed thoroughly conventional advice to her readers. She published a collection of essays on romance and marriage and the keeping of a good figure, addressed to her dear sisters across America. And in her columns, she could be sharp and dismissive toward the new woman, the independent woman, the very idea of a woman who wanted more than a husband. She mocked the feminists. She, of all people, told other women to charm rather than to challenge. The woman who had become Frank Leslie made her living, in part, telling other women to stay in their place. The contradiction was not lost on her contemporaries, and it may not have been lost on Miriam herself. Here was a woman who had divorced and married her way to independence, who ran a corporation under a man's name, who answered to nobody and spent exactly as she pleased, standing before her readers in print to counsel patience, charm, and the careful management of a husband's moods. Perhaps it was pure cynicism, a canny editor handing her audience the conventional wisdom it paid to be told. Perhaps it was a kind of camouflage, the successful woman telling other women what the age wished to hear, so that her own transgressions might pass unremarked in the noise. Whatever lay behind it, the pose makes the turn at the very end of her life all the more staggering, because the woman who spent a career telling her sisters to stay small would leave them. In her will, the means to grow large enough to remake the country, which is what makes the last act of her life so astonishing, that it took the country by surprise, and takes it by surprise still. On Chapter 11. $2 million against the men. The woman who had mocked feminists in her own pages left almost everything she owned to the fight for women's votes. When Miriam Leslie died in the autumn of 1914, her will was opened, and the country discovered that the Empress of Journalism, the 4 times married beauty, who had told her dear sisters to charm their husbands, had willed the bulk of her fortune, nearly $2 million, to a woman she had scarcely known, the suffrage leader, Carrie Chapman Catt, for one purpose only: the furtherance of the cause of women's suffrage. Those were the words. The self-invented Baroness had made her final and greatest reinvention in the one document she could not perform her way out of. The document that spoke only after she was dead. To feel the size of the gift, look at who received it and what she was trying to do. Carrie Chapman Catt was the general of the American suffrage movement, a strategist who had given her life to a fight that was by then generations old and still unwon. Women had marched, petitioned, and lobbied for the vote across generations, and still the amendment failed, state by state, year by year, for want of 2 things above all: organization and money. The movement was rich in conviction and poor in cash, forever passing the hat, forever outspent by the interests that wanted women silent. And into that long, starved war dropped, out of nowhere, from a woman who had never once lifted a finger for the cause. One of the largest single gifts the movement had ever seen. It was as though an army that had fought for decades on empty pockets watched a war chest fall out of the sky. Read against the life, the bequest is almost incomprehensible, and that is exactly why it matters. She had never marched, she had never organized. She had, on the page, belittled the movement she now crowned her heir. And yet, at the end, holding the fortune she had built by becoming a man on a masthead, she handed it to the women, trying to tear down the very wall that had forced her to climb the way she climbed. Perhaps she understood, better than the marchers did, precisely what she was doing. She had spent her whole life proving that a woman could run an empire as well as any man, and had been allowed to do it only by taking a man's name to do it under. The vote was the thing that would let the next Miriam keep her own name. Whatever moved her, mockery turned in the end into the single largest kind of weapon a private person could forge, and she aimed it straight at the world that had made her. It did not pass smoothly, because nothing about her ever did. The relatives came out in force, the descendants and connections of Frank Leslie, outraged that a fortune tied to their name should go to the enfranchisement of women, and they contested the will. What followed was a grim irony piled upon the first. The money meant to free women had first to be fought for in a courtroom against relatives who found the whole idea an affront. And the fight fell to Catt, who was no lawyer and now had no choice. For roughly 2 years, the bequest hung in the balance while the lawyers argued over it. And by the time it was settled, something close to half of the nearly $2 million had been swallowed by the cost of defending it. Miriam, who had spent her life around contested wills, beginning with Frank Leslie's own, would have understood the battle better than anyone. She had left a weapon, and the weapon had to be wrestled out of the hands of people who did not want it fired. But wrestled it was. Carrie Chapman Catt spent something like 2 years and roughly half of the money fighting through the courts to defend the bequest. But enough survived. Out of what remained, Catt built an organization, the Leslie Woman's Suffrage Commission, and poured the money into the machinery of persuasion, the press work, and the organizing that lay behind the strategy suffragists called the winning plan, the coordinated campaign that carried the movement over the top. The money went where money wins wars, into the unglamorous machinery of victory. It paid for organizers in the field, for the printed word, for the coordination that turned scattered local societies into a single national force, all pushing in one direction at one time. Catt had the plan, the ruthless and patient state-by-state strategy she called the winning plan, and now, for the first time, she had the funds to run it at full strength. Historians of the movement have counted the Leslie money among the things that made the final push possible. The gift that arrived at the decisive hour and helped carry a fight generations long across the line. And every dollar of it had come from a dead publisher's estate, from a fortune built under a dead man's name, from the woman who had spent her career mocking the very cause her money now crowned. Miriam Leslie did not live to see it. She died in 1914. 6 years later, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and American women could vote, and part of the money that made it happen had come from a dead publisher's contested estate, from a fortune built under a dead man's name, from the Baroness de Bazus, who was really a boarding house girl named Fallen. The woman who had climbed over men her whole life reached back from the grave and pulled a ladder down for every woman coming after her. There is a temptation to make her a saint at the end, and that would be as false as making her only a schemer at the start. She was neither, and she was both. She was a woman who had understood power with perfect clarity her whole life, who had used every scrap of it the age allowed her, and who saw, at the last, the single largest use to which her fortune could be put. She had lived the whole tragedy in her own body. She had proved that a woman could run an empire, and had been permitted to do it only by taking a man's name to do it under. She knew, better than any marcher in any parade, exactly what the vote would buy. It would buy the next woman the right to keep her own name. It was the most extreme thing any of these three widows did with the fortune the law let her hold. Hetty guarded her money. Arabella spent hers to bury a past. Miriam took a man's very name and identity, and then spent everything it had earned to break the system that had made her take it, hoard it, bury it, or turn it into a weapon and fire it at the wall. She chose the wall. Chapter 12. The Monuments and the Mockery. Walk through the Huntington today, or read the 19th Amendment, and you are standing inside what these widows left. That is the strange fact that outlives all three of them. Their monuments are everywhere, hidden in plain sight, and almost nobody looking at those monuments knows a widow built them. Go to San Marino, in California, to the great library and art museum and botanical gardens that carry the Huntington name, one of the finest cultural institutions in the country, and understand what you are seeing. The eye that gathered those old masters was Arabella's. A great share of the fortune that bought them was Arabella's. The Blue Boy hangs there, and the Rembrandts, because a boarding house girl from Richmond with no provable birthday spent a lifetime and a second fortune assembling them. The institution wears a man's name, as institutions of that age almost always do. The taste inside it, the passion that filled the rooms, belonged to the veiled woman who could barely see the paintings by the end. She built a monument that 1 million visitors walk through, and she built it so well that it hides her. Think of the visitors who pass through those galleries in a single year, pausing before the Blue Boy, murmuring over the Rembrandts, wandering the gardens in the California sun. Almost none of them know they are walking through the life's work of a woman born over a boarding house in Richmond, a woman whose own beginnings were so obscure that she spent a fortune keeping them that way. The collection was her voice, the one she trusted more than her own, and it speaks now to millions who will never learn her name. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that. The woman who refused all her life to be looked at, built the most looked at thing she could, and then vanished into it completely. She had wanted to be seen as belonging, and she got her wish in the only form she could endure, by dissolving into the beauty and letting it stand in her place. Read the amendment that gave American women the vote, and part of the money that carried the fight to victory traces back through Carrie Chapman Catt to a contested will, to a dead publisher's estate, to Miriam Leslie. There is no plaque for that at any polling place. No woman casting a ballot has ever paused to thank the Baroness de Bazus, and almost no one alive could tell you the money was ever hers. Miriam's monument is the most invisible of the three, because it is a right rather than a building or a painting, one exercised so freely now that its cost has been forgotten entirely. And that, in its way, is the truest measure of how completely it worked. A thing taken for granted is a thing that was won so well no one thinks about the winning. The vote is that kind of victory, and a share of its price was paid, unremembered, by a woman the movement itself had once been ashamed to claim. The most conventional advisor to her dear sisters became, in death, one of the great private funders of their liberation. And the right she helped buy is now so ordinary that the women exercising it have never heard her name. And on Wall Street, where they called Hetty Green a witch for decades, the judgment has quietly reversed. The modern histories reclaim her as America's first great female financier, a pioneer of value investing, a woman decades ahead of the men who mocked her, whose only true eccentricity was refusing to perform the wealth she had earned. Set the three of them side by side, and a single shape appears. Each of these women poured herself into something that outlived her, and each of those things took a man's name, or a man's institution, or the plain neutral face of history, and wore it in her place. Arabella's eye lives inside an institution called Huntington. Miriam's fortune lives inside an amendment that names no one. Hetty's genius lives inside the dry histories of finance that, for decades, could see only a witch. The achievements survived precisely because they shed the women who made them. That is the quiet machinery this whole story has been circling from the start. An age that could not abide a woman who owned found a way, in the end, to keep everything she built and to lose only her. The monuments survived, the rights survived, the fortunes did their work and passed on. What did not survive, what the age worked hardest to leave behind, was the women themselves, told straight. They came down to the next century as cartoons. The Witch of Wall Street, the mystery woman behind the veil, the scheming beauty with her 4 husbands and her fake barony. The society that could not forgive them for commanding money reduced each of them to a single cruel line, and the cruel line was what got remembered, while the achievement dressed itself in a man's name and walked on into history without them. To see the achievement, you have to first take off the caricature, and to take off the caricature, you have to ask why the age reached for it in the first place, and why it reached for the very same one. Again and again, whenever a woman took hold of a fortune the law had built to keep from her. Chapter 13. The word they kept for women who owned. Notice what the same society did to all three. Whatever else divided them, they could hardly have been more unlike one another. A frugal Quaker who hoarded, a lavish collector who spent without limit, a theatrical beauty who reinvented herself with every decade. One guarded, one buried, one burned it all in a single glorious gesture. And the world did the same thing to every one of them. That sameness is the thing to hold on to. Not that 3 women in one era were rich, which was rare but not unheard of, and not that 3 women were talked about, which the rich always are. The fact that matters is the sameness of the response, across lives that shared nothing else. A frugal recluse, a lavish collector, and a theatrical impresario had, on the face of it, no common enemy, no shared sin, no reason to be named in the same breath. And yet, the age named them in the same breath, reached for the same handful of ugly words, told the same story about each of them as though it had only one story available for a woman who held a fortune in her own hand. When the response is identical across people who share nothing, the response has stopped describing the people and started describing the age. It points straight at the one thing they had in common, the money held in their own hands and never surrendered to a man. It gave each of them a name to make her small. Hetty the Witch, Arabella the Adventuress, the Mistress, the Schemer, Miriam the Fortune Hunter with a husband for every ambition. It reached every time, for the language of the unnatural, because a woman who commanded money was, to that world, a kind of monster, and a monster needs a monstrous name. It whispered scandal at each of them. About Hetty it whispered forgery and cruelty. About Arabella it whispered the bedroom and the boarding house. About Miriam it whispered the abandoned husband driven out of his mind. It set the family against each of them, the relatives who resented the widow's hand on the fortune, the in-laws who despised the woman who had married too well. And when each of them died, it dragged the will into court, because a woman's last free act with her own money was the one thing the men around her could still try to overturn. Look at how neatly the pattern holds. Give a woman a fortune she did not get from a man, and the age called it witchcraft. Give a woman a past it could not verify, and the age called it whoredom. Give a woman a business she ran better than a man, and the age called it scheming. Give a woman a will of her own, and the age called in the lawyers. The particular charge shifted to fit the particular woman, but the verdict never shifted at all. Guilty of owning, guilty of commanding, guilty of stepping through the one door the law had left open, and then refusing, once through it, to behave as though she were still on the other side. 3 women, 3 different lives, one identical crime, and the crime was simply this. Each of them had money in her own name and would not apologize for it. The same name, the same whisper, the same hatred, the same lawsuit. Across 3 lives that had nothing else in common, the punishment was identical, and the punishment had a cause, and the cause was the house of the law itself. The locked house a wife lived inside, owning nothing, with the one door left open by widowhood. These 3 had walked through that door. That was their whole crime. They had done the thing the law was built to prevent, and they had done it well, and the society that had built the law could not bear the sight of it, and the law did not fall the day these women died. The Married Women's Property Acts had chipped at coverture for decades, but the deeper thing, the assumption beneath the statutes that money was a masculine possession and a woman only its temporary vessel, outlived every one of them. It took the vote, and the long, slow century after the vote, to begin to pull that assumption out by the root. Hetty and Arabella and Miriam did not live to see it loosened. They lived their whole lives inside the locked house, and each of them found the one door, and each was called a monster for using it, and each died before the house itself was ever remodeled. What they left behind was proof, 3 separate proofs, that the thing the age swore a woman could not do, a woman could do, and do supremely well, if only the world would let her keep her own name while she did it. And here is where it stops being a story about 3 dead women and becomes something harder to hold at arm's length. Almost anyone living then, in a good family, raised on the values of the time, would very likely have used those same words. They would have called Hetty Green a witch, because everyone did, because it was easier than admitting a woman had beaten the men at their game. They would have whispered about Arabella, because respectable people whispered, because a woman with a hidden past was fair sport. They would have shaken their heads at Miriam and her 4 husbands. Those words were the common sense of an entire age, handed down like manners, spoken by high and low and kind and cruel alike. And that is the point. The prison these women climbed out of was built of language, plain and ordinary language, and everyone carried a brick of it. And, if the truth be told, everyone carries a brick of it still. Chapter 14. The Color of a Woman Who Owns. Go back to the rented room in 1916, and the old woman in the black dress worn thin at the hem. She is dying now, the richest woman in America, in a flat far humbler than the mansions of the men she outlasted and outtraded. She has spent a fortune of $100 million into being, and spent almost none of it on herself, and she is going out of the world in the same rusted black she wore into every triumph. The papers, even now, are getting ready to call her a witch one last time. But look again at the dress, because by now it reads differently. The black dress was never the sign of a broken mind. It was the uniform of a woman who owned. It began, on all 3 of them, as mourning, the widow's weeds the age demanded, black for grief and black for the man in the ground. And every one of them turned that black into something the mourning code never meant. Hetty made it the armor of a financier too disciplined to waste $1 on show. Arabella made it the veil behind which a whole past could disappear. And in the end, the black stopped saying grief at all. It said command. It said a woman who held her own fortune in her own hands and answered to no one. The color the age pinned on them to mark their loss became the color of their power. Picture the 3 of them in that black, standing together though they never met. The wailing heiress on the floor of her bank, counting. The mystery woman behind her veil, blind before a wall of Rembrandts. The empress at her desk, signing a dead man's name in a firm and living hand. Each of them wrapped in the same dark cloth the age had handed her to mark her grief, and each having turned that cloth into a flag of something the age refused to name. They look from a distance like 3 widows in mourning. Step closer, and they are 3 of the most powerful women their century produced, and the mourning is the least true thing about them. What little they grieved was less the men they had buried than the years they had spent forbidden to be what they so plainly were. That was their crime and their triumph in a single thread. They owned. In a century built on the certainty that a woman should decorate a fortune and never command one, these 3 commanded, and the age reached for its ugliest names to punish them for it. And here is the part that should not sit comfortably. The age did not lose. It called them witches and schemers and adventuresses, and the names stuck, and for the better part of a century, the names were what survived, while the achievements hid inside a man's institution, a nameless amendment, a dry ledger of finance. The women won their fortunes, and the age won the story. Hetty was a miser first and a financier only lately. Arabella was a schemer first, and a collector only to those who look hard. Miriam was a scandal first, and the benefactor of the vote almost never. Each of them beat the men at the game, and was beaten by them at the telling, and the telling is the thing that lasts. That is why the story has to be told again, plainly, with the caricature set down at last. Because the caricature was the final weapon the age had, and it is the only one still firing. And the last question the story leaves is not about them. It is about the reflex itself and whether it ever really died. When a woman today holds a great fortune in her own name and spends it as she sees fit, guards it or builds with it, or turns it into a weapon for a cause, listen for the old words. Listen for witch, for schemer, for the whisper about how she really got it. Listen for the special suspicion the world still keeps in reserve for the woman who owns rather than adorns. And ask yourself where you learned it. Hetty Green, who guarded her fortune like a woman expecting winter, and who was mocked for 40 years by men she could have bought and sold, left behind one sentence that answers the whole of it, and it is the sentence to end on. American women, she said, would be much happier if they learned the principles of business in girlhood. She had learned them in girlhood. They had made her the equal of any man alive, and the target of a nation's laughter, both at once, because she was a woman and she owned. 3 widows walked through the one door the law left open. They hoarded, and they buried, and they burned it all for the vote. And the country that had built the door to keep them out spent a century calling them witches for walking through it, and is only now slowly learning their names. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, thank you, and subscribe, because I have more of these women waiting, the ones the Gilded Age buried under a single cruel word. And before you go, tell me this below. I keep asking which of these 3 widows you would have called a witch, and which one you would have quietly wanted to be. Tell me, and tell me why.